Yeah, I'm going to talk about the U.S.-China relationship, and you know, it's a relationship that has always been challenging. I think for young people such as yourselves, you may feel like we're in a particularly dark period, and I'd say we are. But it's also true that if you go back to the time of normalization in 1979, from that very moment, we've had a set of problems around Taiwan and trade and human rights that have never really left us. But I think it's fair to say that over the past decade or so, the relationship has suffered a pretty significant deterioration to the point that now many analysts and policymakers characterize the relationship as a new Cold War. I'm less interested in naming the relationship than I am in understanding how we got where we are today and what we might do about it moving forward. So that's what I want to focus on and sort of take you through a little bit of recent history, both on the China side and on the US side, and then talk a little bit about where the Biden administration is and what I think, what more we might want to do to ensure that our interests are protected and advanced. So let me start by taking you back just to 2001, on the cusp of China's entry into the World Trade Organization, when then Senator Joe Biden happened to be part of the congressional delegation that was there to sort of be part of that accession process. And he said at the time, the United States welcomes China's emergence as a great power because great powers adhere to international norms in the areas of non-proliferation, human rights, and trade. Now, almost 2 decades later, almost exactly 2 decades later, however, US President Joe Biden offered a very different assessment. He said, we have to push back against the Chinese government's abuses and coercion that undercut the foundation of the international economic system. Everyone must play by the same rules. We must shape the rules that will govern the advance of technology and push back against those who would monopolize and normalize repression. And I think President Biden's 2 statements really bookend both the promise and ultimately the failure of US hopes concerning the path that China would follow as its economy developed. You know, for 20, 30 years, basically the United States approached China through a policy of constructive engagement. You know, what did that mean? Basically, it meant that we anticipated that if we worked to integrate China into the international system of organizations and norms and rules, and we watched as China's economy developed, as its middle class expanded, that China would follow the path that many other countries had, that it would begin to liberalize its economy and its political system, and it would become, in the words of former Deputy Secretary of State Bob Zoellick, a responsible stakeholder in the liberal international order. Instead, I think what we've seen, certainly over the past decade, is that China has moved in a radically different direction. Now, certainly it takes 2 to tango, and the deterioration in the relationship is the responsibility of both countries. But I like to quote my friend Wang Jise, who's one of China's top experts of the US-China relationship. And he said in an interview in 2018, for over 200 years, the United States has never changed its strategic goals for its relationship with China: free flow of goods and capital and free flow of information and values. Chinese have always had reservations or imposed boycotts to oppose these 2 goals. We should criticize and have reason to criticize the United States, but we should realize that China's own actions have changed Sino-US relations and US perception of China. If we are looking for the cause, it was the change in Chinese policy that led to adjustments in US policy towards China. US policy has changed because China has changed. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how China's policy has changed and the impact of those changes on US policy, the kind of the dance that I think has gone on over the past 10 to 12 years. So I think there are really 3 inflection points in how China looks at the United States, how it approaches the United States. The first inflection point was in 2008 when China hosted the Beijing Olympics, the Summer Olympics, and it was really a coming out party for the country. And at the same time, the US hosted the global financial crisis. And Vice Premier Wang Qishan at the time, he was good friends with Secretary of the Treasury, Hank Paulson, and he said, you know, Hank, you are my teacher, but look at your system. We are not sure we should be learning for you anymore. It's a really important moment when the senior leadership of China, even reform-oriented leaders within China, began to think that maybe there was an alternative path. Maybe the United States didn't have it all figured out. Began to have more Chinese officials talk about moving away from the dollar as the world's reserve currency You had more assertive voices coming to the fore, rhetorically, certainly around the South China Sea, and even more aggressive actions within the South China Sea. In response, the United States, and so remember this was the Obama era now, in 2011, we had the pivot or the rebalance, which was a recognition by the Obama administration that the United States needed to devote more of its resources to the Asia Pacific, not only because the Asia Pacific was the most economically dynamic region in the world, but also because there was an emerging challenge being posed by China on the security front, and we needed to be more prepared to hedge against the possibility that engagement might not work, right? That China would go in a different direction. The second inflection point was the advent of Xi Jinping as the General Secretary of the Communist Party in China in 2012 and President of the country in 2013. And she brought to China a fundamentally different kind of vision, a different approach. And he called for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. You know, in part that simply meant reclaiming a greater degree of centrality for China on the global stage, but it also meant a more robust Chinese Communist Party at the forefront of the political system. He wanted an economy that was capable of competing with that of Germany and Japan and the United States on the technological front. And he wanted a People's Liberation Army that, as he put it, was capable of fighting and winning wars. He ushered in, I would say, four significant strategic shifts that I think are in good measure sort of the reasons behind the rethink in US policy. The first was centralizing power in his own hands. So he moved away from Deng Xiaoping's collective decision-making to a much more one-man authoritarian form of leadership. He took control of the most important institutions and commissions and committees that oversaw broad swaths of Chinese domestic and foreign policy. He upended, of course, the two-term limit on the presidency, which meant that he could hold the three most important positions in the Chinese government: General Secretary of the Communist Party, President of the country, and Chairman of the Central Military Commission for life. And he used his anti-corruption campaign to go after his political enemies and competitors. The anti-corruption campaign is a real thing. There are now upwards of 3 million party members out of about 90 million who have been detained and punished for corruption in some way. And Xi Jinping certainly has taken corruption seriously. He said, corruption could mean, if not addressed, could mean the death of the Chinese Communist Party, even the death of the Chinese state. But he definitely used it to go after people that he felt could challenge him. The second big shift was the reassertion of the role of the Chinese Communist Party in the Chinese people's everyday political and economic life. Again, one of the hallmarks of the Deng era was a retreat of the party and the introduction of more market forces, market both in terms of the economy, but also the marketplace of ideas, and welcoming sort of outside ideas from the outside. Xi Jinping feels very strongly that the Chinese Communist Party needs to be at the center of the political system. So, he has created a massive surveillance state, hundreds of millions of cameras capable of facial recognition. They're working on voice recognition and gait recognition. So even if the camera can't see your face, they can identify you by how you walk. You can look at what's happening in Xinjiang if you really want to see, what would epitomize a surveillance state. Upwards of 1 million Uyghur Muslims in labor and re-education camps. There's the development of a social credit system in China, which is basically an effort to measure the economic and political trustworthiness of the Chinese citizens. So it was supposed to roll out in sort of a complete national form last year. It didn't really happen. There are many pilot projects underway. It seems that there may not ever be one single social credit system, but the idea is basically that the Chinese government at the local level will be able to collect information from the court system, from the cameras, for surveillance cameras, and from all of your activities on your phone, right, and develop some kind of composite score. And that score will then be used to offer you rewards or punishments based on, how closely really you emerge, I think, as a model citizen, as a citizen who aligns him or herself with the goals and ideals of the Chinese Communist Party. And so Different kinds of metrics that have been used are things like, did you participate in a protest? Or did a friend of yours participate in a protest, right? So there's a kind of coercive, social coercive mechanism that's engaged. Did you act up on a train that was, somehow was caught by that surveillance camera? Have you not repaid your debts? So all of these things can be brought together, and then your children can either jump to the front of the line for the best schools, or they can not have access to the best schools. You can be up for a promotion at the top or at the bottom. So all sorts of ways that different localities are using these types of data to mold what is considered to be sort of, again, the ideal citizen. And certainly we've seen just in the recent past a much greater enhanced role for the party in Chinese companies, right? And so this is something that, at least to me, frankly, was clear from 2013, but many people, I think, were misled when they read the document that came out of the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress that said, China will allow a greater role for market forces. But what people ignored was the other part of that document that said that the state would retain a commanding role. And so now when people are seeing what's happening with the Chinese tech sector and all of the involvement of the party in the tech sector and the cracking down, people are surprised. But really, there's no reason to be surprised. Xi Jinping is all about control. There was never a moment in which he was going to allow, Jack Ma and Pony Ma and Robin Li and all these big tech, billionaires to go too far outside the party, to develop independent power bases, right? To allow the content, of social media to expand too far beyond what the party could control, or even to allow these tech companies to have access to Chinese people's personal data beyond that that the Chinese government itself could access. So you may have seen that the Chinese government has taken a stake in ByteDance, right, which is the company that owns TikTok. So they've taken a 1% stake, and they have a seat on the board. Again, no surprise for anybody who's paid attention to Xi Jinping and the direction of his policy, but apparently a huge surprise for many people in the US business community. The third big shift is what I would call Xi Jinping's creation of a virtual web of restrictions and regulations that allow him to control more closely what comes in and goes out of the system. And Jackie mentioned in her talk what's going on with the Chinese internet, the degree to which the Chinese Communist Party controls access both within the country, but also, and censors information in the country, but also, what is able to come into the country from outside. But other sort of ways in which the Chinese government has sought to limit the ability of outside forces to shape Chinese domestic political and economic considerations. So in 2017, Xi Jinping pushed forward a law on the management of foreign NGOs that moved control of the 7,000 or so foreign non-governmental organizations that worked in China on issues like poverty alleviation and healthcare and education from the Ministry of Civil Society to the Ministry of State Security. Already that should tell you how Xi Jinping viewed these NGOs. He often calls them hostile foreign forces. In fact, many things that come from outside China are referred to as hostile foreign forces. So that's that move. So in 2017, from January 2017, there were 7,000 foreign NGOs operating in China. Today, there are roughly 500. Right? In doing that, of course, Xi Jinping also undercut one of the most important pillars of support within the United States for a robust and positive approach to China, namely civil society. The second, or third, really, effort that Xi Jinping has undertaken is really to limit access of multinationals to the China market. And so the first big move he made was in 2015 with Made in China 2025. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. This was basically the Chinese government's effort to say that in 10 critical cutting-edge areas of technology, they wanted Chinese companies to control the manufacturing of components. So in things like new energy, vehicles, or artificial intelligence, or new materials, or medical devices, they were going to limit the ways in which multinationals could have access to the Chinese market. And I'm happy to talk more about the way that they've been doing that if people are interested. It's really quite interesting, the different tactics that are taken. And now, recently, and I think this is something that hasn't gotten much attention, but should get more attention, I think this effort is expanding to include a number of other areas in which multinationals have traditionally had market dominance in China, namely things like pharmaceuticals and cosmetics, tourism, sports, entertainment. So at the two sessions, which is the annual gathering of the National People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference this past March, there was just a small mention of the fact that the Chinese companies needed to play a much greater role in these sectors, and that foreign companies had too much of market share. So if you follow Chinese politics, and I know that some of you do, you know that the way you understand the way the wind is blowing is by looking for the very smallest signal of change. And this, to me, is a small signal of change. So watch it. And next year, if I'm back, you can see whether I was right or not. But I'm pretty sure that I am. So I think we should be watching to see, whether consumer products and services, and again, areas like where Procter & Gamble or Mars Candy, where these companies have really dominated in many respects, whether or not they're getting squeezed in the same way that technology companies have been squeezed. And then finally, I think the fourth big shift under Xi Jinping, and the one that's most evident to people outside China, is just a much more ambitious foreign policy. Right? So you have the turn toward a greater authoritarianism, toward greater control on the domestic front, but on the foreign policy front, we just have a much more ambitious and expansive foreign policy. And I think you see this, and I'll just tick these off, and we can, again, talk about them more if people like. But first, in the area of sovereignty, right? So Xi Jinping has moved from just staking claims around sovereignty to realizing them, tightening controls in areas within China that are restive, like Xinjiang and Tibet and Inner Mongolia, and of course just taking all the era out of the democracy in Hong Kong and making it really just another Chinese city. Moving out from there, more assertive policies with regard to Taiwan and the South China Sea, and pushing out from there even, we saw during COVID-19, within the first 6 to 8 months that the Chinese government used that period, right, to push forward on other sovereignty disputes, like the border dispute with India, even the border dispute with Bhutan, Nepal, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Japan and the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. So that's number one. And Xi Jinping often talks about the sovereignty, right, Chinese territory, as sort of part of China's body. And so, the blood running through China, and you can't cut off the arms or the legs of the body, right? And that's what it would be doing if, in fact, you were to say that China couldn't control the parts of the country that it considers to be its parts of the region, that it considers to be its sovereign territory. Beyond that, I think China is determined to push the United States out as the preeminent power in Asia, in the Asia Pacific. People often ask, does China want to replace the United States as the, sole global superpower? I think it has interest in the rights of being a superpower, but not the responsibilities of the superpower. But it definitely has interest in pushing the United States out as a preeminent power. And how is it doing this? Well, it calls for the end of the US-led alliance system. It's developing regional organizations like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that exclude the United States. Xi Jinping frequently gives speeches where he talks about Asia is for Asians to govern, right? So basically making it as though the United States doesn't really have a role to play in the Asia Pacific. A fourth sort of element of Xi's more ambitious foreign policy is the effort to exploit the openness and use the leverage of the Chinese market to coerce other countries to align themselves with Chinese political and economic interests. I think for the United States, one of the best examples of this is certainly the case of Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets. And I see from people nodding, you're familiar with this case. So I won't go into detail about it, but it's a fascinating case, not only because Daryl Morey, for those of you who don't know, tweeted out in November of 2019, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." Chinese government retaliated by stopping the licensing deals, cutting the broadcasts for the Rockets, cutting the broadcasts of NBA games. But beyond that, what was interesting, and again didn't get as much play perhaps as it should have, was what CCTV came out and said, right around the time, right after the tweet, which was issues related to sovereignty and social stability don't fall within the purview of free speech. Right? So if you stop to think about what that means, it's basically an entity of the Chinese government saying that people outside China can't talk about any issue that China determines to be related to social stability on a platform, Twitter, let's face it, that the Chinese government doesn't even allow within its own country. So, you know, a lot of people at the time of the NBA dispute, you know, said, listen, if you just don't talk about issues that are third rail issues, like, you know, core sovereignty issues, you'll be okay. But it's clear that's not the case, right? So China went after, right, the Wall Street Journal, expelled the Wall Street Journal reporters for a piece that, you know, had the title, you know, referring to China as the sick man of Asia, that was written by Walter Russell Mead. It was an opinion piece. He doesn't even write for the Journal. But they used that as an excuse to expel the Wall Street Journal reporters. They threatened the German car industry if Germany didn't allow Huawei into its 5G infrastructure. And of course, they've launched a massive boycott against Australian goods because Australia was front and center in leading the charge in terms of calling for an investigation into COVID. So none of those things actually touched on China's core interest, Taiwan, as they defined them, right? Taiwan and sovereignty issues. But basically anything can be considered, you know, an issue that is tied somehow to Chinese stability. Anything can threaten the Chinese Communist Party. I just think that's a really important point to understand when we try to think about, when people talk about how the US and other countries might want to moderate their behavior, right? That somehow if we moderate our behavior, we will elicit better behavior from China. For the most part, I don't think that's true. I think China is of the, you know, China operates where if you give them an inch, they will take a mile. You know, we can, you know, push that discussion further. There's a lot of debate about that. And then finally, I think in the foreign policy front, Xi Jinping has called for China to lead in the reform of the global governance system. And this is one of those issues that you know, unless you're sort of deeply involved in political science and Chinese politics, you're probably like, ugh, you know, like it's the United Nations, it's multilateral institutions, you kind of think it's kind of boring, but actually it's really important because this is where China is pushing to change rules around human rights, around internet governance, where China uses the United Nations and its you know, programs and institutions to set standards for technology like 5G. It puts its people in senior positions, in the top positions of these agencies to advance Chinese interests. And so the US has to be aware of what China is doing you know, in this space because it's like a multi-level game for China, right? It's basically taking what China believes at home, its political and economic system at home. You know, it spreads it out. Oh, and of course I forgot to mention Xi Jinping's signature issue, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. Sorry about that. So the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, which, you know, began in 2013 as a hard infrastructure project, but has morphed and evolved since then, you know, into a digital Silk Road, which is, you know, fiber optic cables and e-commerce and satellite systems. There's, you know, the security component with China's first military logistics base in Djibouti. I think there will be more of these to come in Cambodia and Pakistan. There's a political element to this where China is exporting elements of its political system abroad. Here, too, this is a big debate in Washington among the sort of analytical community. Is China actually exporting, you know, its system? Xi Jinping said that the Chinese model presents a worthy alternative to liberal democracy for countries that aren't interested in following that path. I happen to believe that China is exporting elements of its model, so you can see it in places like Tanzania and Uganda, where they're training, Chinese officials are training officials there on how to do real-time censorship of the internet or to control civil society. To me, export doesn't mean impose. It simply means it's like exporting a good, right? You're exporting a good to a willing, you know, recipient, to someone who's interested in purchasing that good. So no, it's not imposing its model in other countries, but it is in fact making available to interested parties China's political system, how China does business. So if you think about, as I was starting to say, that three-level game, it's basically taking China's political and economic system, spreading elements of it through the Belt and Road, right? Through capacity building, through the technology that it's putting in place, and then trying to write the rules of the game through the United Nations and other international institutions. So this is a long-term project and one in which China can devote enormous resources. And I think that's something that often escapes us, is just the sheer number of people that China has to devote to this enterprise. It makes it very difficult in many respects to compete.